The disappeared island of San Borondón, where evil resides. Based on real stories. The night was warm, but the cool glow of the computer screen made Anthony Greaves feel a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. He zoomed in on the image again and again, trying to understand what his eyes were seeing. The photo, captured by a weather satellite, showed a patch of land where, officially, there should be nothing but the Atlantic. Even more disturbing, the image did not exist in the database from previous days. The island wasn't there yesterday. Conspiracy forums exploded with theories as soon as Anthony posted the image. Some spoke of a satellite failure, others of a new, volcanic island emerging from the ocean. But a small, shadowy portion of commenters mentioned a name Anthony had never heard before: Saint Borondón. Intrigued, he delved into a spiral of ancient texts, forgotten maps, and disturbing accounts. The island had appeared and disappeared for centuries, always confusing navigators and defying logic. In the following days, more images emerged. Each one showed the island forming and disappearing, like a ghost in the middle of the ocean. The radars picked it up for a few moments before losing the signal. Pilots flying over the region reported seeing a piece of land shrouded in thick fog. But when they tried to get closer, she simply evaporated before his eyes. It was then that Anthony received a cryptic email. The sender was an explorer and documentary filmmaker named Richard Holloway. In the subject, just one sentence: "I've been there." The body of the message was short and to the point. Richard claimed to have found San Borondón years ago, but what he saw there haunted him for the rest of his life. He was putting together a team for a new expedition and wanted Anthony to join. The promise was tantalizing, a discovery that would change science forever. Despite his initial excitement, something about the email bothered him. At the end of the message, Richard wrote a strange warning: "If you agree to come, be ready to never be the same again. The island is not just a piece of land. It watches you. It chooses you." The following days were a succession of charter flights, secret meetings, and a growing feeling that they were messing with something that should remain forgotten. In addition to Anthony and Richard, the team was made up of 6 other experts: 2 scientists, an archaeologist, an investigative photographer, and 2 mercenaries hired for security. Each brought with them a mixture of skepticism and morbid curiosity. The night before leaving, Anthony had a strange dream. In the middle of an ocean as dark as oil, an island appeared before him. But she wasn't normal. It pulsed, as if it were alive. On top of a hill, a motionless figure watched him. No face, no eyes, just a black hole where a face should be. When the figure raised his hand, he woke up in a cold sweat. The expedition set sail at dawn. The fog on the horizon seemed to form strange shadows, as if something was waiting for them in the middle of the ocean. Saint Borondón was waiting for them. The ship Orpheus had cut through the waters of the Atlantic under a gray and heavy sky. The air carried a salty, damp smell, as if the ocean knew where they were going and was trying to warn them in some way. Anthony watched the horizon, feeling a growing weight in his chest. The engine roared low, but for some reason he felt as if he were completely silent. The crew was not superstitious, but there was something wrong with the way they avoided looking east, in the direction where, according to the coordinates, San Borondón should be. Richard Holloway, the expedition leader, was trying to keep the group focused. He had the posture of a classic adventurer: stubble, discreet scars on his face, and the look of someone who had already seen more than he wanted to. "We are making history," he said, as he distributed maps and old papers, with records of the island. How many explorers have had the chance to see a legend materialize before their eyes? We are about to change everything. But not everyone was so convinced. Emily Carter, a renowned archaeologist, leafed through one of the maps with a tense expression. "What if it's more than a myth?" he murmured. "What if there is a reason this island appears and disappears?" Her tone was serious, but it was drowned out by the skepticism of Sam Delacroix, one of the scientists on the E. "You mean mirages, atmospheric distortions, magnetic phenomena? It could be anything." He laughed, but the laugh seemed forced. "Don't you think there's something very convenient on an island that plays hide-and-seek with the world?" As they argued, the radio in the cockpit crackled. A transmission coming from a fishing boat in the region. The voice on the other end was distorted, almost unrecognizable, as if it was scratched by static and something else. Something that shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be going there. The island. She sees you first. The transmission was interrupted by a high-pitched noise like a muffled scream. The captain of Orpheus, an experienced man named Alvarez, turned off the radio with a sharp movement. He looked at Richard and murmured in Spanish, "You paid well for this trip, so I'm going to the agreed point. But when that island appears, me and my men are going to turn this ship around and get out of here. And if you're smart, go with us." The wind grew stronger, cutting the deck with damp, electrically charged gusts. Emily pursed her lips. This is not just superstition. There's something wrong. But no one backed down. None of them wanted to be the one to give up first. The fear was masked by pride and curiosity, the perfect triggers to lead them straight into the unknown. As night fell, the fog on the horizon seemed to thicken, moving like something vivo. The stars disappeared, erased by an unusual darkness. Something awaited them beyond that veil. And deep down, they all already knew they weren't just going until the island. The island was coming to them. The dawn enveloped the Orpheus in impenetrable darkness. The once choppy ocean was now eerily calm, as if it was holding its breath. The wind stopped completely, and the only thing that could be heard was the ship's engine resounding in the vastness of the Atlantic. Anthony was on deck, feeling the air thick and heavy, filled with something he couldn't name. It was as if the world itself had stopped. It was then that the fog appeared. It came not as a subtle curtain, but as an opaque white wall, swallowing everything around. In a matter of minutes, visibility dropped to almost zero. Captain Alvarez and his men began swearing in Spanish, trying to control the ship without success. The compass spun wildly, the hands spinning illogically. The electronic instruments blinked before simply die, as if an invisible force had drained all the energy around. "This isn't normal," muttered Emily, holding tight to the railing. Sam Delacroix was trying to reset one of the navigation systems, sweating as he pressed the buttons. "No GPS, no radio, no nothing," he said, swallowing hard. "It's like we were isolated." A bang echoed across the deck. One of the crew ran to the side of the boat and pointed to the water. "Oh my God, look!" The sea, previously calm, was moving in reverse. The waves dragged backwards, as if pulled by something beneath the surface. Tiny bubbles emerged in precise rows, forming impossible patterns. How if something was breathing just below the hull? Could this be a seismic phenomenon? Richard asked, trying to remain rational. But no one responded. The air was too heavy. The mist now carried a sound, a low, almost imperceptible but constant buzzing sound, a noise that seemed to be resonating inside each of their heads. Suddenly, a scream tore through the fog. Everyone turned around at the same time. One of the mercenaries, Jack, was standing on the aft deck, shaking violently. He pointed to the void in front of him. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes were wide, fixed on something no one else could see. "Jack!" Richard shouted. running over to him. But before he could reach him, Jack took a step back and disappeared into the mist. There was no sound of impact on the water. There was no screaming, just one devouring silence. For a moment, no one could move. Anthony felt his heart pounding inside his chest, trying to understand what had just happened. Captain Alvarez stepped back, crossing his chest with a religious sign. "This island is choosing you," he muttered, eyes wide with pure terror. And then, without warning, the ship's lights went out. The Orpheus. I was now adrift. In the belly of the unknown, San Borondón was close by, very close. The darkness seemed to have become a living organism around the Orpheus. The fog, previously only dense, now moved as if it had a consciousness of its own, sliding across the deck and wrapping around the crew's legs like invisible fingers. Silence was absolute, oppressive. No waves hit the hull, no wind cut the air. The world seemed to have been swallowed by an endless void. Then the fog began to dissipate. It was like watching a macabre theater where the curtain slowly rises. First came the shadow, huge, irregular, pulsating, no horizon. Then the silhouettes appeared, silhouetted against a sky that seemed darker than before. Twisted trees, jagged cliffs, and high above, the threatening outline of something that resembled ancient ruins. St. Borondón had appeared. For a few seconds, no one moved. It was as if their bodies were paralyzed by the shock of seeing the impossible materialize before their eyes. Anthony felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the island, it didn't feel static. Their forms undulated slightly as if the earth itself were breathing. "Oh my God, this is real," Emily whispered, her voice almost lost in the silence. Richard was the first to come out of the trance. His face lit up with a mixture of elation and obsession. "We are about to make history," he turned to the crew. "Prepare the boat. Let's set foot on that island before it disappears again." But Alvarez didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the island, his expression filled with unshakable terror. "This isn't common land," he muttered, not facing anyone directly. "This is a place cursed," the crew murmured uneasily among themselves. One of them, a young sailor named Diego, crossed himself 3 times before retreating into the ship. None of Alvarez's men seemed willing to go any closer to the island. Richard's euphoric excitement contrasted with the sailor's palpable fear. He turned to the main group. "This is exactly what we are looking for. Did you feel it? This presence? This magnetism? This island is not just a piece of land, it is something bigger." Anthony, even overcome by fear, knew there was no turning back. They were there, faced with the impossible. If he left now, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what was in that ghost land. "Come on," he said, trying to control his racing pulse. "Before it disappears again." The boat was lowered into the still water, and one by one the explorers descended, rowing toward shore. As they got closer, the silence became even more suffocating. Not even the sea seemed to want to touch the high island. When the first feet touched the cold, dark sand, a shiver ran down Anthony's spine. There was no wind, no sounds of birds, insects, or any sign of life. The island was empty, but not abandoned. Something was there, something that watched them, something he had always been waiting for. The black sand gave way beneath the explorers' feet as they advanced deeper into the island. The gnarled trees looked like frozen shadows in the thinning mist, their branches reaching like misshapen fingers into the starless sky. The group moved in silence, only the muffled sound of boots on damp earth breaking the crushing stillness. The island seemed to be waiting for them to speak first. "We set up camp here," Richard announced, choosing a clearing near the beach. We don't know how long this island will remain visible. We need to record everything before it disappears. As they set up their tents and adjusted their equipment, Anthony noticed something unsettling. None of them had said out loud that they would spend the night there. It was as if everyone was avoiding thinking about it. What would happen when the sun rose? What if the island disappeared with them inside? Night fell quickly, as if someone had ripped the light from the sky in a single movement. The heat of the fire brought little comfort, and the silence was soon replaced by a new sound. Something distant, something that shouldn't be there. At first it sounded like the rustling of wind through the leaves, but there was no wind. Then came a sharp crack, as if twigs were being broken, followed by a more subtle noise. Low, drawn-out breathing. Anthony exchanged glances with Emily, who was clutching a flashlight hard enough to make his fingers pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Before he could respond, a scream tore the forest. The group jumped to their feet, flashlights sweeping through the darkness. The sound had been human, or something that wanted to look human. Could it be Jack? Whispered Sam, referring to the missing mercenary on the ship. But no one responded. Fear had tightened his throat. The vegetation moved. Something was there, lurking. The light of Richard's flashlight captured a figure in the trees. Small, thin, with grayish and deformed skin, watching them with empty eyes. For a second the thing remained still, and then without warning ran towards them. The flashlight failed. The fire shook as if a shadow had swallowed it inside. The group backed away, pulling out guns and knives, ready to fight something that they shouldn't have found it. When the lantern came on again, the clearing was empty again. No footprints, no sign of the thing. Just the overwhelming silence of the island. But Anthony knew. He felt the thing was still there, just waiting for the lights to turn off. The first light of morning appeared dim and sickly, dyeing the fog a greenish hue that made the world seem unreal. Nobody slept well. The forest was silent after their encounter the night before, but that only made everything even more disturbing. It was as if the island had retreated, waiting for the right moment to attack again. Anthony looked around the camp. The tired faces of the group said it all. They were being watched. There was no doubt about that anymore. "We have to explore the interior of the island," Richard announced, adjusting his backpack. "If there's something here, we need to document it." Emily hesitated. "The thing we saw yesterday, what if there are more of them?" Richard didn't back down. "Better to know now than wait for them to come to us." The forest was dense and suffocating, the air thick with humidity, and a strange smell of wet earth mixed with something rotten. As they advanced, the feeling of being followed never left them. Lanterns swung back every few steps, but nothing moved, or at least nothing that wanted to be seen. It was Sam who found the first sign that they were not alone there. "Oh my God, look at this." Among the trees covered in moss and almost unrecognizable were ruins. Carved stone columns, some collapsed, others still standing like forgotten sentinels. Primitive engravings covered the surfaces. Strange symbols, interlocking circles, and elongated humanoid figures, with empty eyes and arms too thin to be human. Emily ran her hand over one of the symbols, her heart beating fast. "This is old, much older than anything we know." Anthony bent down to look at something buried in the damp soil. With a careful tug, he removed the object and felt his stomach turn. It was a wristwatch, but it wasn't just any watch. The glass was cracked, the leather strap was worn, but the mark was clear. He knew that model. It was modern. He turned to Richard. "That doesn't make sense. If this island has been appearing and disappearing for centuries, how could something so recent be here?" Richard picked up the watch, his eyes filled with a realization he still didn't want to accept. Because... He swallowed. Why others have been here before us. The silence was interrupted by a dry sound, a snap of a branch breaking behind them. Anthony turned on reflex, the flashlight sweeping through the trees. But what he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't one of those deformed creatures from the night before. It was a man, or at least what was left of one. His face was parched, the skin pulled tight like old leather. The eyes were empty, but there was something worse. Something that made Anthony recoil in pure terror. The man was wearing an identification badge, Jack, the mercenary who had disappeared on the ship. And then he smiled. Anthony felt the air escape from his lungs as he stared at the man before him. Jack was there, standing between the trees, but he shouldn't be. Jack had disappeared on the ship, swallowed by the fog. And now he was dry, withered, like a corpse, forgotten in the sun. Emily screamed, pulling Anthony back. Richard shone the flashlight at Jack, and in that instant, he had disappeared. No sound, no movement. Just it disappeared. For a moment, no one moved. Were their eyes deceiving them? Or was the island playing with their minds? Sam, who had been holding a stopwatch since they stepped onto the island, swore. This is wrong. He showed the visor shaking. It says we've been here for 15 minutes, but we've been walking for hours. The others checked their own watches. Everyone kept different times. Some said they had arrived 3 hours, others that it was still the same minute that they left the camp. Emily turned to Richard, her face pale. What the hell is going on? He opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. The truth was that he didn't know either. The sky began to change color. The sun, which should be high, now it was descending rapidly. The day was ending much faster than it should have. That's not possible, Anthony muttered, feeling his stomach drop. Time is wrong. One of the mercenaries, Miguel, looked up in terror. What if the island doesn't just disappear into the sea? And if she disappears in time? The silence that followed was unbearable. Suddenly, the sound of the forest changed. It was like the surrounding space itself had been distorted. The noise of leaves in the wind became more serious. The cracks of broken branches seemed to come from very far away and very close at the same time. And then, a new voice echoed through the trees. A female voice, whispering something in a language that none of them knew. Emily grabbed Anthony's arm. We need to get out of here, now. But as they turned to head back to camp, they realized that there was no longer a way. The forest, it was no longer the same. They were in a completely different place. The island had changed around them, and now there was no way back. Desperation took over the group. The way back to camp no longer existed. The trees had rearranged themselves, as if the island had moved its insides while no one was looking. Each crooked trunk seemed exactly the same, and the dim light of the eye. Setting sun made the shadows stretch into impossible shapes. Anthony swallowed hard, feeling cold sweat run down the back of his neck. The island was playing with them. Stay together, Richard ordered, trying to sound in control. But his voice was shaking. He felt it too. Something was wrong. Sam took the compass out of his pocket, holding it tightly. The pointer was spinning, non-stop, as if it had gone crazy. We have no direction, he muttered. We are completely... Crack. The sound came from behind them, a loud, dry crack, as if something large had stepped on a branch. Everyone turned around at the same time. Miguel, the mercenary, it was no longer there. Anthony's heart skipped a beat. Michael? He swung the flashlight the way they came, but there was no sign of him. No sound of footsteps, no warning shouts. He just disappeared. "He was right here," Emily exclaimed, panic taking over her voice. "So the forest," he responded. "Help!" Miguel's voice came from somewhere among the trees, but it was strange, distant and muffled, as if being heard through a thick wall. "Help me." Richard pulled out his flashlight and stepped forward. "Miguel, where are you?" The voice came again, but this time it was coming from above. Everyone looked up at the same time. The tree canopy was dense, and among the branches, a silhouette stood hanging, but not from a rope. Of something invisible, something that held him as if gravity didn't affect him. The flashlight light flickered, and for a brief second everyone saw it. Miguel was there. His eyes were wide. His mouth was open as if he wanted to scream, but no sound was coming out. Then, in the blink of an eye, he disappeared again. Silence fell over the forest, and then, "Help!" The voice came from multiple directions at the same time. Emily covered her ears, shaking. "That's not him! That's not him!" Anthony felt his stomach sink. Miguel hadn't just disappeared. The island had taken its voice. The forest murmured. Miguel's voices continued to echo around the group, coming from all sides, some distant, others dangerously close. Each call was an imperfect replica of the previous one, like a corrupted echo that I learned to imitate, but never exactly. "Help! Help me! Please, it's so dark!" Emily pressed her hands to her ears. "This isn't real," he whispered, eyes wide. "This can't be real." Anthony turned to Richard. "We need to get out of here now." Richard nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the darkness between the trees. Something was there. Multiple silhouettes began to appear in the mist. First, they were just shadows. But then, as the lanterns illuminated them, they took shape. They were humanoid, but wrong. Pale, thin, impossibly elongated. Their faces were grotesque simulacrums of human faces, mouths too wide, deep-set black eyes, and skin taut like dry leather. But the worst was the sound they made. Each of them repeated Miguel's words, but now with different nuances. "Punch," a female voice this time. In Emily's voice, "Help me," a serious, drawn-out tone. In Richard's voice, "Please," a faint whisper. In Anthony's voice, Anthony froze. They were learning. Emily stumbled backwards. "They're imitating us," he muttered. "My God, they are trying to be us." One of the beings took a step forward. His mouth opened at an impossible angle, his jaw shifting as if trying on a new body. And then he said, "Emily." The voice wasn't Miguel's. It wasn't from any of them. It was from someone who didn't belong to that time. Emily shouted, and the group took off through the forest. But the island changed around them, closing paths, lengthening distances. They weren't running away. They were being guided to something much worse. The group ran through the darkness, panting, hearts racing like frantic drums. The forest seemed to close in around them, the tree trunks forming barriers where paths once were. The creatures followed them, but did not run. They just walked, slowly, knowing they didn't need to rush. Anthony was holding the map that Richard had drawn since they arrived on the island, checking the route they should take to return to camp. But when he shone the flashlight on the sheet, he felt his stomach sink. The drawing had changed. The contours of the island were different. The trails they had followed now led to nowhere. The camp, which was supposed to be a few minutes' walk away, it simply no longer existed on the map. "This is wrong," he murmured, voice hoarse. "The map has changed. That doesn't make sense." Richard took out his own compass, but the pointer was spinning around and around, useless. "The island is moving." Sam ran ahead and stopped abruptly. "Stop!" Everyone stopped, almost colliding with each other. The path that once led back to the coast now ended at a cliff. The abyss stretched before them, black and endless like the mouth of a hungry monster. "This wasn't here before," Emily whispered, shaking. They turned and took another path. 10 minutes later, they returned to the same place. One perfect circle. The whispers began again, coming from the trees. Voices familiar and unfamiliar, distorted like a scratched old recording. Anthony felt a deep shiver. They were no longer on the island. The island was within them. Richard gritted his teeth, holding the flashlight tightly. "We cannot stand still. We will continue until we find a new path." But deep down, everyone knew the truth. There was no path. The island I didn't want them to leave, and in the suffocating silence of the forest, something he laughs. The group advanced through the darkness with cautious steps, knowing that the island was folding around them, rearranging itself like a living maze. The cliff in front of him, the disappearing paths, the useless compass. San Borondón was not a place. It was a trap. Emily was the first to spot the ruins. They appeared suddenly, hidden behind a curtain of dead trees and collapsed stone towers. "This wasn't here before," she whispered. In the center of the ruins, there was a semicircular structure, like an altar or a ritual space. Smooth, ancient rocks covered in moss and hand-engraved symbols. But they weren't just symbols. They were... Richard brushed away the dust with shaking hands and narrowed his eyes. Latin. The characters were weathered but still legible. Emily took out her notebook and started translating. With each word he deciphered, his face grew paler. "The sea swallowed us, but the land held us. The island doesn't disappear. We disappear. It takes us, devours us. We were the first, but we won't be the last." Anthony felt his stomach drop. This was written by someone who was here. Emily turned the page on the block and continued to read the fragments engraved on the stone. Here mentions a name, Diego de Mendoza, 1572. Richard's eyes widened. Mendoza was a Spanish explorer. It is said that he disappeared while searching for unknown lands. But reports stated that he and his crew sank in the sea. Anthony swallowed hard. What if they never sank? The wind blew cold through the ruins. The trees swayed, and a dry sound resounded in the distance. A guttural murmur coming from the heart of the island. Sam clenched his fists. "That means, if the island doesn't disappear, are we going to disappear?" Emily looked around with newfound fear. What if Mendoza and his crew are still here? Everyone froze. Richard shined a light. On a far corner of the ruins there were footprints. Fresh, and they weren't theirs. The silence was broken by a single thought that crossed everyone's minds at the same time. They were not alone. Anthony felt his chest tighten as he analyzed those fresh footprints on the damp floor of the ruins. They were human, but unequal. Some were too deep, as if the weight of the body had changed throughout the walk. Others were long and deformed, the fingers stretching beyond what was natural. Something that was once human still walked there. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "We're out of here," Sam said, turning on his heel and grabbing his backpack. "This is no longer an investigation. This is a fucking trap. I'm not staying to become part of this island's history. We can't just run away without understanding." "What's going on?" Richard countered. "If this island is alive, if it traps people here, we need to figure out how..." "Fuck finding out," Sam exploded. "Did you see what happened to Miguel? Do you think we wanted to find those things that imitate our voices? Do you think any of us want to know what happens when the island consumes us?" The group split. Sam and one of the remaining mercenaries, Harris, began running in the opposite direction of the ruins, in the direction where they thought, which was the beach. Anthony wanted to stop them, but he hesitated. What if they were right? What if the only option was to run away while they still could? "Sam, don't go alone," cried Emily, running after him. But Sam and Harris were already far away. Fear gripped those left behind. Richard knelt down beside the ancient scriptures, muttering to himself. Emily trembled as she held her flashlight. Anthony felt his own heart hammering in his chest. The island was breaking them. Then a scream cut through the area. Sam. Anthony turned his head and saw fog forming in the distance, dense, thick, crawling across the floor like a living liquid. Sam and Harris were close to the beach, running desperately, but the fog was catching up with them. Too fast. "No!" Emily screamed. The mist swallowed Harris first. He tripped, fell, and it disappeared. His body dissolved into smoke as if he had never existed. Sam looked back, and then the fog enveloped him too. The group watched, horrified, as the mist swallowed his skin, his bones, his existence. But before it disappeared completely, he raised his face towards them and smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone desperate. It was the smile of someone who already belonged to the island. When the fog receded, they were no longer there. No footprints, no clothes, nothing. Richard fell to his knees, finally understanding. "There is no escape," he murmured. "We're already dead. The island I had taken 2 more, and now..." She was hungry for what was left. The fog slowly dissipated, but the silence that remained was even worse. The space where Sam and Harris had been seconds before was now an absolute void. No traces, no marks on the ground, as if they had never existed. Emily was shaking, eyes wide, breathing too fast. "We need to get out of here," she muttered. "Now." Richard was still on his knees, whispering something inaudible to himself, his eyes lost. The island was breaking each of them one by one. That's when a metallic smell filled the air. Anthony felt the nausea rising before he even understood what it was. A sudden wind swept through the ruins, bringing the strong, sweet odor of fresh blood. "There's something here," he murmured. Everyone turned around at the same time. A few meters away, next to a pile of mossy stones, there was a body. Anthony's heart stopped for a second. Era Harris. But he wasn't just dead. He was dry. His skin felt like parchment, stretched over his bones like old leather. His eyes were open but sunk inside the skull, 2 empty black orbs. His mouth was frozen in a wordless scream of pure terror. Emily choked on a sob. What happened to him? Anthony approached hesitantly, fighting the instinct to run away. When he raised the flashlight to better examine the corpse, he felt the cold run down his spine. There wasn't a drop of blood. Harris hadn't just died. Something had completely drained him. "What did that?" Richard whispered, his voice emotionless. Anthony slowly turned his head to the side. His gaze fell on the rocks behind the body. Something was wrong with them. The moss there was not greenish like the rest of the island. It was red. Blood. The stone had sucked Harris's blood like a sponge. The island had drunk from it, and then Harris's dead eyes moved. Emily screamed. The group retreated at the same time, but he didn't really move. Your eyes just followed them, as if something inside him was still there. It was at that moment that Anthony realized something. The island didn't just devour the bodies, she then kept him conscious. Harris's dry body was still there, his eyes sunken, following each of them. But it wasn't just that. The corpse murmured. The words were low, as if they were whispers carried by the wind. There was no movement on the parched lips. But the voices were there. "Stay." Emily stumbled back, holding back a scream in her throat. Richard clenched his jaw, fists clenched at his sides, trying not to show fear. But Anthony, he listened more than the others. The whispers weren't just coming from Harris. They came from the earth, the trees, the rocks, as if the entire island was speaking directly into your head. "You already belong to me." Anthony pressed his temples tightly, his eyes closed. "Get out of my head." Never. The sound has changed. They were no longer just words. They were images. Suddenly he wasn't there anymore. He was seeing the past. Through eyes that were not his own, he saw others before them. Explorers, sailors, men and women lost in time, all arrested in the same trap. He saw the twisted faces of hunger, of hallucinations, of despair. He saw hands scratching the ground, trying to get away from something invisible. He saw bodies being sucked into the mist, consumed by something that didn't belong to this world. And then he saw himself. He saw himself, standing between the trees, with his eyes empty, his skin dry and lifeless. The island had already taken him. He fell to his knees, panting, trying to suck in the air that seemed to escape his lungs. The vision dissipated, and he returned to the clearing, shaking. Emily and Richard held him by the shoulders, trying to bring him back. "Anthony, what happened? What did you see?" He raised his head, and the answer came out in a barely audible whisper. "The island doesn't want us to leave." The wind blew strong, taking with it a distant laugh. I was hoping they would understand. "St. Borondón, I wanted them forever." The wind increased, carrying with it the whispers of the island. They came from all sides, slithering between the trees, wrapping themselves around the explorer's skin like invisible snakes. San Borondón surrounded them, slowly tightening his noose around them. Anthony trembled, still feeling the echoes of the vision. Emily stared at Harris, or at what was left of him, while Richard held the flashlight hard enough to snap his fingers. Fear had reached its limit. Now, paranoia was starting to spread. And then came the snap, a quick movement. Richard pulled out his knife. Anthony felt the cold blade press against his neck before he even understood what was happening. "Richard!" Emily screamed, backing away. But he didn't give in. His eyes were wide, shining with insane desperation. "The island needs sacrifices," he whispered, his voice filled with uncontrollable fear. "That's what happened to the others. Someone always disappears first. If we give them what they want, they might let us go." Anthony swallowed hard, feeling the blade press into his skin. "Richard, that's not how it works." "How do you know?" Richard spat out the words. "How can we be sure? And if we just need to—" "Listen to yourself," Emily screamed. "You want to kill someone to please an island that is using us as toys?" The forest remained silent, and then the island responded. "Try." The voice didn't come from Richard. It didn't come from Anthony, nor from Emily. She came from the land itself. Richard smiled, a sickly smile. He thought he had been chosen. Before he could plunge the blade into Anthony's throat, a bang echoed through the forest. Something separated them. Something invisible grabbed Richard and pulled him back, away from Anthony, away from Emily. He fell to the ground on his knees, eyes wide in pure terror. The earth beneath your feet opened. Skeletal, rotting hands emerged from the ground, grabbing his arms, his legs, his chest. Richard tried to fight, but there was nothing to be done. The dead of San Borondón, they had come to look for him. He was dragged to the ground, his face frozen in a soundless scream. When the hole closed, there was nothing left. Nothing. Emily fell to the floor, panting. Anthony raised his hand to his neck where the blade had pressed seconds before. The island had chosen his next victim, but now they were only two, and they knew that the island he wouldn't settle for just Richard. The forest was silent again. San Borondón had taken one more. Anthony and Emily stood there, motionless, their faces pale in the cold moonlight. The place where Richard was dragged, it no longer looked different from the rest of the island. No traces, no marks on the ground. It was as if he had never existed. Emily broke the silence first. "The island is playing with us," she whispered, eyes wide. "It's waiting, slowly breaking us." Anthony swallowed, his throat feeling dry. "Then we can't let her win. We need to get out of here, now." And then, as if the island itself had heard them, the impossible happened. The distant sound of an engine echoed through the air. They both froze, eyes turning to the beach. A beam of light flickered through the fog, cutting through the darkness with the yellow glow of a searchlight. A boat. Anthony jumped to his feet, his heart beating frantically in his chest. Emily brought her hand to her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. "My God," she gasped. "Someone came to get us." They ran. The trees seemed to open up, the path finally taking them to the beach. The sea, before so still, now undulated slightly beneath the approaching vessel. It was a fishing boat. Small but real. Concrete. "Hey!" Anthony shouted, waving his arms. "Here, we're here!" The light found them, momentarily blinding them. A man was at the bow, holding the reflector. His silhouette seemed normal, his movements ordinary. Emily fell to her knees in the sand, sobbing. "We did it." But Anthony felt something wrong. The vessel was too close. He didn't remember hearing anchors falling into the water. No voice shouted, "Back." No sound of engine running properly. The boat didn't make waves. He looked at Emily, who was still crying with relief, and felt a deep shiver run down his spine. What if this was just another trick? The man in the bow began to climb down a small rope ladder. His face was still hidden by the light. Emily stood up and took a step forward, ready to run to him. Anthony held his arm tightly. "Emily, wait." She turned to him, surprised. "What's wrong? They're here to save us." But Anthony couldn't move. Something inside him screamed that nothing was right. The man finally went down to the beach, and then the spotlight wavered for an instant. Enough time for Anthony to see. The man's eyes were black. No pupils. Lifeless. And then he smiled. The same smile as Sam gave before being swallowed by the mist. Anthony pulled Emily back forcefully. "This is not a rescue." The wind blew stronger. The boat was not a savior. It was an invitation to something much, much worse. Emily tried to resist, but Anthony held her arm tightly. "Look at him," he whispered through gritted teeth. "Look properly." The man on the beach stood still, his head cocked to the side, as if was waiting. The light from the boat wavered, casting impossible shadows on the damp sand. The vessel made no noise. The sea around her did not move. Emily's eyes widened when finally saw. The man blinked, but not in the way a human would blink. The black eyes closed from top to bottom, as if an inner membrane covered the empty darkness. His skin looked false, like an ill-fitting flesh mask. Emily stifled a scream and took a step back. The thing on the beach smiled wider. The wind blew, carrying something new. Whispers. But this time they weren't just in Anthony's mind. Now Emily could hear them, too. "You came. You belong to me, like everyone else." Anthony looked around, his heart beating so hard it hurt in his chest. The island was talking. Not through a single voice, but through thousands of people who have been there before. The words fluttered in the wind, changing tone, language, emotion. Some pleaded, others laughed, others whispered like lovers sharing a secret. But they all said the same thing. The cycle continues. Anthony fell to his knees. He finally understood. St. Borondón, it was not an island. It was an entity. Not just a cursed place, but something alive. A predator. She fed on souls, on time, on fear. She played with her victims, deluded them with hope, broke them little by little, sucking out their minds, their memories, their identities, until they became part of her. "You're next." Emily began to cry, her lips trembling. "No, no, no." But Anthony knew it was too late. The island, I wanted them there. And she never let anyone go. The wind whispered secrets that Anthony and Emily, they didn't want to hear. The voices didn't stop. They came from the sky, the ground, the rocks, and the sea. They were inside them. "You're next. You already belong to me." Anthony pulled Emily by the arm, trying to pull her away from the boat. "This is not real. None of this is real." She resisted, still shaking, still wanting to believe. "If it's not real, then what is? What is happening to us?" Anthony swallowed hard. You knew. The boat wasn't there to take them back. I was there because I had already taken them a long time ago. The island, it didn't just devour those who stepped on it. She absorbed them. St. Borondón, it fed on memories, time, identity. Those who disappeared, they didn't die. They became the island. And then Anthony saw it. The truth came crashing down on him like an impossible weight to bear. He looked at his reflection in the dark sea and saw something that made him take his breath away. He had no reflection. He turned to Emily and it wasn't there either. Or at least not the way it should be. His skin looked translucent, as if fading. His silhouette flickered like a flame about to go out. Emily looked at her hands and started screaming. They were already dead, or worse. They were already part of the island. Maybe from the moment they set foot there. Maybe since before. In the end, how much time had actually passed? Emily's scream echoed across the beach, but it didn't last long. His body began to dissolve before Anthony, like mist in the wind. First, the fingers, then the arms. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and all Anthony saw was absolute terror. "Anthony, help me!" And then she had disappeared. There was no explosion, no shadow, no body falling to the ground. The island swallowed her without a trace. The wind blew stronger, as if the earth itself was sighing with satisfaction. Anthony stood there alone, staring into the void where Emily had been seconds before. The overwhelming silence of the island engulfed him. His lungs burned. His heart hammered inside his chest. But he didn't run. He didn't scream. Because deep down he already knew. He always knew. St. Borondón had already taken them all. He wasn't fighting to survive. He was struggling to accept that had never survived to begin with. He looked out into the dark sea and saw the faces. Everyone else was there. Emily, Richard, Sam, Miguel, Harris, all. Her hollow eyes watched him, waiting. The island no longer needed to play with him. There was no escape, he was the last, and now all that was left was will be delivered. Anthony closed his eyes. There was no longer any reason to resist. San Borondón had won. The tide rose around him, lapping at his feet with water as cold as death. The mist crept toward him, up his legs, his arms, his face. He didn't try to fight. The island did not kill his victims. She made them part of herself. As the darkness consumed him, Anthony heard the whispers one last time. But now he understood them completely. It was all the voices that came before him. They were those who got lost and never returned. Now he was one of them. And then San Borondón, it disappeared. The fog slowly retreated, dissipating over the ocean. The sea became just a sea again. The sky cleared. The stars shone innocently. The Orpheus was never found. No recordings, no sign of the explorers. San Borondón left no trace. She didn't want to be remembered until a new calling appeared. Days later, in an isolated laboratory, a scientist frowned in front of a satellite screen. An island had appeared in the middle of the Atlantic. She wasn't there yesterday. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "You won't believe what I just found." The cycle started again. San Borondón always returns, and there will always be new victims.